When people think of B2B marketing, usually they think of the boring stuff. The white papers, the corporate videos, the super long reports. But great B2B marketing doesn't have to be like that. And as we explore in this episode, there's a lot actually that we can learn from the entertainment industry, specifically on how to grab attention quickly. Today's guest, Jeremiah Glodoveza, SVP, Head of Marketing and Communications at Nium, says that a lot of us in fintech marketing often get too bogged down into the details of how compliant our product is or how fast the technology is. Instead, we should focus on the core pain points to grab attention and use that to then tell a story. For example, say you're targeting a payments manager. The 1st and the 15th of the month are super stressful times for payment managers who need to ensure all payments go out on time, are accurate, and all accounted for. Instead of focusing your messaging on how great your platform uptime is, you could choose to focus on how your platform helps make those dates of the month a lot less stressful. Anyway, super interesting, and that's just the tip of the iceberg of what we talk about with Jeremiah. Jeremiah himself has extensive experience in marketing. He previously worked in the entertainment industry and then went on to work in large tech companies, most notably Early Warning, where he helped develop the marketing for Zelle, the payments network in the US. He's now at Nium, a global leader in real-time cross-border payments that supports 100 currencies across 220 markets and is currently valued at over $1 billion. So yeah, he really knows fintech. In this episode, we talk about what fintech marketing can learn from entertainment, how Nium grew to over 220,000 followers on LinkedIn and leveraged it for brand growth, how the role of the marketer is changing and is more focused on revenue and why that's actually a good thing, why the best marketers today are those who know how to make the most of technology. I thoroughly enjoyed this chat and I hope you do too. You're listening to the Market Like a Fintech podcast. My name is Araminta, MD at Mint Studios and partner at the Fintech Marketing Hub. And with this podcast, my aim is to explore the strategies and tactics that top marketers around the world use to grow fintech companies. We have discussions about how to navigate compliance, the intricacies of marketing technical products, and targeting hard-to-reach ideal customers. All of that while living the startup life. I hope you enjoy this episode. I'd like to start with my first question, which is, I know that you have quite a lot of experience in the entertainment industry. So I'd love to hear from you. Tell us a bit about what it was like working in the entertainment industry and what you did. And then also, what do you think like fintech B2B marketing can learn from the film and the entertainment industry, and what have you seen works there?
No, it's a good question. So my experience comes from years back. I was involved at Microsoft in the last physical media format war, for those old enough to remember pre-streaming days. Before you actually were able to stream shows and films, you actually got packaged media typically from a location. And I worked on a competitor to what was the last format standard, which was Blu-ray. I worked on a product called HD DVD, which is in the annals of time as one of the failed experiments in technology. But it allowed me to really work closely with the studios that were minting and creating content, because in any format war, what really matters is the content that's being produced, and close partnership with the entertainment industry in terms of how they market their films. And what's really interesting and what I learned from entertainment is just, it's about grabbing attention fast. Right? Watch any film that you particularly enjoy, particularly like an action film or even a drama. There's something that gets you hooked immediately, whether it's a scene or it's a piece of the script. The attention is grabbed fast and then they keep it, right? There are moments where ebbs and flows in the story, but they grab your attention fast and they keep it. And I think that that's something that fintech marketers typically struggle with, right? Like, we get so mired in the speeds and the feeds or the legalese associated with the regulation that we have to comply with, that we forget that at the end of the day, we've got to create these emotional connections, tell stories that are built on tension and arcs and all those things that you learn, not even in entertainment, but in basic writing classes when you're in school. So I do think that B2B marketing, particularly in fintech, we've forgotten and lost some of our way. And instead of talking about the characters or talking about the customers in this regard, We talk about the technology, and we don't ever step out of the impact that that technology has on our customer bases.
Yeah, so the crux of that is really like hooking people and telling stories. And I was going to get to storytelling later, but I think we could talk about it
Yeah.
now, which is, yes, storytelling is more important now than ever. What would you say is a good example of that? Because I always find that, storytelling is important, but it's hard to kind of see that in practice. Like, I don't know
Mm.
if you have an example of maybe a B2B company. It doesn't have to be fintech that does storytelling quite well. Like, what does that mean in
Yeah.
marketing?
I think that the example I'm thinking about is maybe less B2B, but they used a consumer approach in a B2B setting. So, for example, the company was Zelle, which is the payments network here in the United States, a company that I had the privilege of working for prior to my role here at Nium. And what they really sought to achieve was more awareness around fraud and scams. And they wanted to tell in a relatable way the impact of falling victim to a fraud or scam scheme. And so what they did on a podcast similar to this, they took the format of a true crime podcast, basically, right? And if you think of any of the great true crime podcasts, whether it be Serial or otherwise, you really get invested in the characters, right? They looked at not murders, but a financial crime, right? Like that was perpetrated on an individual, whether it be an elder abuse scam or, someone being taken in a Ponzi scheme of some sort. But they really took a deep dive into some of these financial crimes. They introduced the characters. They showed the criminals and their motivation. They talked about the victims and what was going on in their heads in a fun and entertaining way. I thought that that was a great example of storytelling applied in our space that you typically don't see.
So just to clarify, is that so they set up a
Yeah.
podcast
Mhm.
and were these stories real or are they fictional?
Yeah. No, they
They
were
were
real
real.
stories.
Oh,
They were
wow.
real stories. So the stories featured interviews, right? And I listened to some episodes about, a puppy scam, right? So they went into the story about the daughter and why she wanted the puppy that she always wanted and the length that the parents were taking to try to find a legitimate breeder. And then their explorations online as they found different sources, and then the interactions between the scammer and the target and what those look like and how it looked legitimate in terms of the conversation. So much like these true crime podcasts do on different types of crimes, they really took that financial crime angle and did some amazing storytelling around it.
Yeah, and so that's really cool. So were they doing that to raise awareness of fraud amongst like just regular consumers like you and I, or
Correct.
yeah?
Yeah. And because it's a topic that banks and credit unions issue tons of warnings
Yeah.
about scams and fraud and tips and tricks for not falling victim to it. But it doesn't hit home for many people until they either hear that it's impacted a family member or they read or listen to a real
See.
life story about somebody potentially losing their life saving.
Yeah, it becomes more tangible. So if let's
Yeah.
say we've got a head of marketing listening to this and they work at a payment company and
Mm.
they're like, or maybe, I'm thinking maybe not even a payment company, it could be like a identity verification company.
Sure.
And they wanted to do a podcast like this because this could be a good,
Yeah.
I don't know, you're targeting what, compliance professionals probably. And I know you've
Yeah.
said on other piece of content and other podcasts you've been
Yeah.
on, it's about making sure that your ICP is the hero. You want to make them the hero.
Yeah.
So in this
Right.
hypothetical example, if you worked for an identity verification company, how could you kind of do a podcast maybe that's a similar kind of story? I know I'm putting you on the spot.
Yeah. If you're at an identity verification company, say, right, I think these podcasts that do a good job tell stories from the different perspectives, sorry, right? Where it could be the decision maker that ultimately is evaluating sort of the risk signals, or it could be the data scientist who is telling the story about, okay, here's what we're looking at, and here's how we're keeping you safe, right? It could be ultimately the end user who has to then make a risk-based decision or kind of reading those data sets. But my point in the example on the podcast side and on this identity verification side is that we typically use single spokespeople to explain sort of a case, right? Like even if you watch some of the typical case studies, it's one person in the department, and Nium is guilty of this too, speaking about their experience with a product. What I would be suggesting here is when you start to think about these case studies, to think about them incorporating more than one perspective from the department, end user perspective, and others, so that you round out and have sort of some of this creative tension. Like, we've talked about like, how do you make the target or the customer the hero, right? And the example that I was thinking about going into this, not for a podcast, but was, we don't really surface what the day-to-day job is like for the people that are using our products, right? Like, what Nium is doing, enabling, at a payroll company, ensure that employees and contractors around the world get paid on time on the 1st or the 15th, right? Right. And, the story I was thinking about was like, you tend to think about the 1st and the 15th as being really exciting times from an employee perspective. I'm going to get paid today. That's super exciting. But when you take it from the other perspective of the person sending the payment, that can be some of the most stressful days in the month, right? Like if there's a failure, it's on you. And if that payment fails, then the impact on that employee or that contractor and the ripple effects of not being able to get that paycheck are far reaching, right? And we don't necessarily kind of highlight, that part of the story, right? We talk about the mission critical nature of payments, but we don't necessarily talk about, okay, what does it exactly does that mean? What goes through that person's head as they're about to hit send? And then who's enabling them to live more stress-free? Oh, that's us as the partner, right? So I think there's room there, even in sort of the rigidity of B2B marketing, to actually use similar tactics, but just explore different application within the tactic that we use in the day-to-day.
Yeah, I really love that example. So if we continue on that example, the head of payments who's very stressed on the 1st and the 15th, how would you then put that in your marketing, like at Nium? Like how would you run a campaign where the campaign says something like, don't be stressed on those 2 days, something like that? How does that translate into marketing for?
Yeah, I think for us, obviously static forms like copy and in email nurture campaigns, etc. Right. But I've been talking to our team about, and some of these things will come to light over the course of the next few weeks, is to diversify the content types that we tend to use, right? Like we are taking more cues from the consumer side, right? Shorter form video, quote cards, slideshow carousels, and then even longer form pieces that we're actually able to cut up, particularly in video. And so when I'm instructing sort of my team to do these case study interviews with various stakeholders at a company, we're asking these more emotional questions versus not just like, what was the return on investment on the service we're providing? How many hours did you save? Blah, blah, blah. But I mean, that will come out in the story, but like, how did you solve this problem without us? How did you feel? Were you nervous? What helped alleviate some of that stress? We asked some of those questions to try to get the customer more comfortable talking about their experience in their own words and how it played out.
Yeah, and I think if we now follow on to talking about how Nium does a good job of standing out,
Sure.
I think one good example of storytelling is your LinkedIn, your company LinkedIn. You went from, I heard this from another podcaster you were on, you went from 10,000 to 100,000 followers in like 18 months. And then now you're at over 220,000, which is amazing. Yeah. What do you think contributed to that growth? And I'm also curious, because everyone always says personal LinkedIn has better engagement. But I'm curious, what have you seen is the impact of having one of the biggest fintech LinkedIn?
Yeah, it's one of the biggest. Thank you. And we're particularly proud of it, right? And I think that a couple of things have led to that sizable growth, right, over time. It did not happen overnight, let's be clear. First, I would say it was content. From a content perspective, what I mean by that was a variety of content pieces distributed on a fairly aggressive cadence, right? So valuable content delivered frequently and with value measured by the level of engagement that we were driving, whether it be shares, likes, or downloads. So that was sort of core. I wanted to make sure that this wasn't just not just announcements, right?
Yeah.
Even though that is part of what we do, that's
Yeah.
certainly. But then the second piece would be amplification, right? So we really encourage our colleagues to participate in the conversation, right? And to be an active participant in the marketing of their company, right? And so we encourage them to share the content to their networks. And so we created this network effect, which every brand aspires to, right? So where it is now almost routine that front-facing client teams are sharing content on a regular basis. And then I think that we also finally had the benefit of an executive team with high following that also believes in the power of LinkedIn and would be part of that amplification process. But again, really important that we started foundationally with producing great, valuable content on the platform.
Yeah. And what kind of benefits have you seen from it? Do you feel like it really helps with recruitment, for example, or what do you think it's helped with the most?
And I think that I would say next to sort of organic search, most of our inbound traffic to the website comes from social media. So when we talk about social media, LinkedIn, and to some degree X, the channels that we participate in, but it's LinkedIn primarily. I would say that that's been the benefit. And then I think there's the benefit also of just a general awareness, right? Like anecdotally, we hear when we go to events that, yes, we know you. And, how do you know us? It's through LinkedIn, because our content has surfaced through the algorithm to some of the more important decision makers around the world.
Wow, that's amazing. Would you mind sharing a bit, what is your setup? Do you have like a team internally who are dedicated only to social? Or because, I mean, it's a lot of, you're creating carousels, you're creating high quality content. Like, how do you do it?
Yeah, I'm afraid to kind of share the secret sauce, but like people think that behind the scenes at Nium, there are large teams. Right. And I would tell you that my marketing team is probably less than 10 to cover a global entity, with annual revenue over $100 million, right? Like this is a fraction of the size of most organizations. But we do a good job of creating great templates. And so when we do invest in a content piece, we're able to ensure that we get more than one use out of that content piece. So there's a lot of adaptive reuse of our content pieces. I'm proud to say I have a very talented, dedicated internal team, as well as a small supporting cast of agencies that help us produce great stuff.
Yeah.
Tiny but mighty, for sure.
Yeah. So what are a few other things that Nium does that you would say helps you stand out as a brand and not be like the boring payment companies? I know you've sponsored cricket, and you also, maybe we can talk about this later, but you've separated two brands. So I'd be curious to learn a bit more about that. But yeah, let's focus on the standing out and not being the boring payment company.
Yeah, let's talk a little. I'll talk about maybe events, and then I'll talk about sponsorships in a second, right? I think events is one way that I think we've stood out, right? And, part of my philosophy here comes from my background in consumer marketing, particularly in the telco industry. So early on in my career, I had this realization where I was looking at the advertising from Verizon and at the time Sprint and T-Mobile and AT&T, the biggest carriers in the country. We were sitting around in a marketing meeting with all of the ads for these companies laid out, and they all looked the same, right? Like smiling, youngish individuals looking at their phone and delight at the phone, right? This was pre-selfie, right? Yeah. So they were just enamored with the quality of the device, I guess. And we used to call it shiny, happy people, right? Like the REM reference, right? What I swore was that even industries that I would work in that looked on the surface the same, that I would do my best to stand out. Right? Whether it was in the look and feel or the experiences. And my background is primarily on the experience side. Like I did some pretty exciting things at Microsoft with experiential marketing. And so with Nium, we took that approach, events. And so, for example, like everybody shows up at Money 2020, which is sort of the seminal event in fintech, as you guys know, especially the event in Vegas. Everybody does a happy hour, everybody does a dinner, but nobody really paid attention to the experience within the event. And how do you deliver content that's interesting, engaging, and at the end of the day, fun, that you would want to step away from the seafood platter at a JP Morgan event and go attend. So Money 20, a couple of years ago, we did a comedy night, right?
Cool.
And not just your standard comedy night. We found a few founders that were willing to take a risk, and we had them roasted by a comedian, right? And had them just all vulnerable on stage, like talking about their stories, which are important lessons, etc. But in the context of, fun. And just the amount of laughter from that session was just amazing. And we followed that up with a well-known Netflix comedian. And so it's delivering, and we started to brand these experiences, these evening experiences, Nium at night, right? Like, it was really an attempt to share with the fintech community, after you've had a long day, the last thing you want to do is sit around and watch a presentation and get the hard sell, right? Like, so how can you engage in a networking environment, discuss topics at your leisure and be entertained in a fun and exciting way? And so we've kind of taken that Nium at night concept and delivered it in markets around the world to a ton of success. So that would be one way that we've kind of been working on standing out. The other way that you asked about was just sponsorship in general, right? I'm not going to claim that we're the first to explore sponsorship at all. Many brands do. But we were one of the first kind of fintech brands to look at cricket as a sponsorship vehicle, right? Like, little known fact that behind football, cricket is the most watched and played sport in the world.
Wow.
Right. Particularly due to the popularity of the game in countries like India and Pakistan. But, sponsorship was more than just placing a logo on signage boards and being about broadcast eyeballs, although certainly that was part of it. It was about the experiences that we could deliver in partnership with the game that tied back to our kind of corporate and brand values. So, for example, we really stand for innovation and championing the fintech community and particularly the payments community. So we sponsored a hackathon, the first ever for the international cricket community. And from that hackathon came a bunch of viable technology ideas that would advance the game in areas of AI, in areas of virtual reality, et cetera, that are actually being commercialized today. So it was really about how do we leverage the game as a brand awareness vehicle, but also as a tool to really highlight some of our brand and corporate values.
Yeah, and I've also heard from other people that it's actually smarter to go sponsor events where there's not tons of payment companies, so like not another Money 2020, and instead sponsor where there might still be heads of payments who like to go to cricket matches, but there's no other payment company. So you're going to stand out, and it'll hopefully be cheaper than Money 2020. Or the ROI will be maybe greater.
Yeah, and it's a captive audience too, right? Like, you would be surprised how many bankers and heads of payments and vendors are big fans of the game, right? And cricket is one of those things where you can get really immersed in the sport, right? Like, you can get onto the field with some of these experiences. You don't necessarily get that type of treatment, I would say, from an F1, let's say, as an example, right? A different type of sport.
Yeah, no, really good point. I'd like to shift gears to talk a bit more about branding. So you mentioned in another interview that you were on another podcast that there's an interesting kind of change where marketers have shifted from just taking care of the brand to taking care of both brand and revenue. And I think, we've all seen this. Everything is becoming more financially oriented. The CFOs are more in charge, which means that, marketers are being held accountable for revenue. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on, what does that mean for marketers? Is that a good thing? What do you think? And do you think, where is it going to go from here? Is it just going to become more pronounced, or do you think things will change with AI? What are your thoughts on?
Okay, so 100% a good thing.
Okay.
Right? because I come from the days where, marketing had this perception that it was just to make things pretty function,
Yeah. Yeah.
which was unfortunate given the level of talent and ability in the field, right? And I had come from a background in communications and in product. So that stigma always offended me, right?
Really.
Like in terms of, hey, I can make a PowerPoint amazing, or I can make a great ad, but I too have the same business degree that most of the C-suite hold, that my talents are probably being underutilized, right? So absolutely, I think that marketing can be a revenue engine if the leadership team and the board give it the room to run,
Yeah.
right? And I think that the best CMOs today actually think like CROs, right? And report into a CRO, or they've been one previously. Because CROs, they don't care about impressions, they care about pipeline and conversion rates, right? And ultimately deals won, and whether or not the work that you were doing actually had a contribution to some of those wins, right? They think about competitors and competitive differentiation, etc. So I do think that this move towards more of a quantitative approach to marketing is a good thing, right? Because then you combine the science side of it with the art side, which we've always been great at, and you can really start to drive a focus on more than just acquisition, but you can start to look at things like expansion, retention, loyalty, right? And so this line between sales and marketing, I think, is blurring significantly. In fact, even my KPIs are the sales team, right? Like it isn't a handoff anymore where I can say, oh, well, 20 to 25% of inbound leads are being shipped over. I can kind of wash my hands and be done. At the end of the day, the ROI of the marketing program is based on revenue generated. And so I really need to partner closely with the sales team to convert and actually get these clients transacting so that we can increase revenue accordingly.
Yeah, I think I agree. And it's also
Sure.
very rewarding to be able to go to work every day and see the hard impact that you're making with numbers. You can see, and it's because of the work that you're doing. And this is why my agency specializes in the lead gen side of things, because we can prove that it's working, and also it's more exciting. It's like, wow, look, we're helping grow this company. It is a balance as well, as you said, because you also need to give marketing the room. It's not like you're not going to get leads immediately. It's going to take a while. And this is the balance that needs to be struck.
Yeah, and I think previously the functions were speaking different languages, right? And the level of marketing jargon, which, I see some of my team speaking at a sales kickoff, right? Like, it's not what the business cares about, right? Like, nobody cares about, how many form completes. They want to know, okay, who, and ultimately, like, are they going to buy my stuff? And so some of those next level insights need to be thought through, and we need to start speaking common vernacular, right? Which is the language of numbers. And so I do, particularly when I'm hiring folks, I tend to gravitate towards those that have business mindset, because they're kind of well-versed in speaking to not only the tactics that they're driving, but also the quantifiable impacts.
Yeah, well, this was the next question I was going to ask you. Say we've got a marketing manager who's listening to this and they're aspiring to be a CMO or a senior marketer. What do you think are the skills that they have to build in order to be able to speak that language, to be more like the CRO, or to be able to communicate better with the sales team and the CRO? What are the skills that they should be focusing on?
I think that the soft skill that they should develop is empathy, right? And what I mean by that is, how do you develop that, right? Like, I think it's really spending a lot of time with stakeholders outside of the marketing function, right? Like, how many marketers truly spend time with customers, right? Or prospects? Have you pitched in front of them? Have you actually listened to what they care about? Similarly, like with the sales function, have you shadowed a salesperson and what they go through? Right? Like, how do they prep for calls? How do they follow up? What triggers do they pay attention to? right? So I think if foundationally as a marketer, if you start there, the other skills around how to read a P&L statement and a balance sheet, all of that, that's useful to some degree. But I think that the most useful thing is and the value that you can bring as a marketer, or you're supposed to bring as a marketer, is do you understand the market and the customer, right? And I do think that empathy is one of those skills that could be developed, and strong listening skills are a big part of that.
I really like the idea of shadowing for like maybe a few months or something, each department, someone in each department, and then you'd understand a lot better. Definitely sales you'd learn so much just from
account management would be another one. And then also the product team, right? Because then you can start with, once you get pretty advanced in your skill set, you can share the inputs that you're hearing from customers and sales back to the product team. And then it's a bi-directional conversation and exchange of value. But I really urge marketers to spend a ton of time with all of these key functions outside of their own to round out their experience.
On another podcast, I heard you saying that the difference between a good and a bad marketer is how they harness technology. So the one that is on everyone's mind at the moment is obviously AI. I would love to hear, what are some examples of how maybe a good marketer who wants to be a great marketer can use AI, but it could be any technology really, to become that great marketer? What do you mean by that? And what are some examples of it?
Yeah, so I think good marketers can adopt technology, right? Like use ChatGPT and write a basic prompt, right? But great marketers figure out how to take technology and in a way that creates leverage, whether it's and enables them to do something that they could not do without said technology, right? In the case of AI, whether it's automation or hyper-personalization or some sort of predictive analytical behavior, that's where the difference is. So let's use AI as an example in terms of how can marketers use AI to be better at their jobs, right? In prepping for this, I kind of wrote down 3 things, right? AI is going to help you do things faster, so speed, right? AI can write, it can design, can analyze faster than any human, right? The quality of which we can debate. You and I are very much fans of the written word, and we can debate the quality, but great marketers know what to feed AI engines so that they can get faster speed, like prompts, high quality inputs, etc. Right. The second thing that AI can help with is scale. My team was working on nurture track emails, for example. We were able to write prompts that had us produce a 5 email nurture based on key verticals that we're pursuing, right? Even though those first drafts weren't perfect, they were developed in seconds versus a first draft that would have taken weeks. So, and then you can then spend the time scaling the program in terms of hyper-personalization. You can write a prompt that's more directed, and you can even use tools that look at signals in the public sphere to map a specific email to the signals that you're seeing. For example, I see from the hires that you're making in your payments organization that you're looking to expand your business relationships in the Philippines, right? Making that level of connection manually just isn't possible, right? Scale, I think, and personalization is the other thing. Smarts would be the other one, right? I think it helps marketers be more strategic. I do think that some of the latest findings coming out of deep research is, if I worked at a consultancy, I'd be worried. It helps us be more strategic. On a smaller scale, we can start to look at how we use AI to build reports, how do we use AI to spot trends, etc. But what AI I don't think will replace is the 4th S, which is style, right? Which is that many of us as marketers have some of the best intuition when it comes to what looks and sounds good and human and will make that deep emotional connection, right? So I think that that's where there's room in an AI world for us as marketers to still add value and add some style to the substance that we know that AI will help us achieve with speed, scale, and smarts.
Yeah, what a comprehensive answer. Thank you. I very much agree. And I like what you just said there, that it's about style. And I think you've said this as well, where you'll only be able to get that if you're really well connected to who you're targeting, the customer. Because that, I don't see how AI, like, yeah, you can feed the AI your sales transcripts and you can feed it like lots of the interactions you're having with customers. But that deep human, understanding what that human, your ideal customer persona, that as a person, what their fears are, only another human, I feel, well, so far, only another human can really understand that. And like what you said about the 1st and the 15th of the month being really stressful, couldn't an AI understand that and really, I mean, they could create the copy for it, but the input will still have to come from that other person, the marketer, understanding that that head of payments is really stressed out on the 1st and 15th. So it's about understanding those triggers and those worries. So,
Yeah, it's hard for an AI to understand what the concept of stress is, even. Right. And that's where I think storytelling is the way to do that. Like, stress for me as a payment manager is I can't sleep the night before because I'm thinking about whether or not the payment's going to go through. Right. And then you can describe that in human terms, right? Like, instead of getting up at my regular, 7 a.m., I'm getting up at 4 a.m., nervously staring at this screen, wondering if the payment is going to go through. I don't do that anymore because I have the peace of mind that the payment will go through because of the vendor that I've chosen. And here's why they enable me to sleep better at night, right? Like, AI is not going to deliver that emotive prose yet. Right.
Not yet, anyway. And I think it's good news for those of us who got into marketing because we're obsessed with kind of psychology. And what gets me excited is understanding what made someone click that and not another thing. What made someone pick that vendor over another? And that's kind of consumer psychology or buyer psychology. I know we're close to time, so I just wanted to end on one last question, which is you did a LinkedIn post recently about a new habit that you've been building where at the end of every week, and you share an update with everyone. And I thought it was really cool. So I'd love it if you could share what that new habit is. And how have you been finding it? Is it useful? Has it helped with alignment?
Yeah. We're recording this on a Friday, so I have to actually produce this update that I've been talking about. But like, I call it the 4P update, which not intentionally modeled after, the 4P in marketing. But I really wanted, and maybe to talk about the genesis of it, I feel that we don't do a good job of marketing ourselves. And it's maybe the modesty or just the service-oriented mindset that we have that we typically don't keep our peers informed about the values that we're bringing each week, I would say, right? Like, because there's so much output. And I was telling people that my function is the only one that has probably a day-to-day public record of output because of the prolific nature of what we publish on platforms like LinkedIn. So this 4P update, the first P stands for projects. I've summarized the 2 to 3 achievements for the week in terms of completed outcomes. The second P would be progress, longer term initiatives that we made progress on and what some of those key milestones were. The third P is performance. This is where the quantitative side of marketing comes through. Not only how many leads, but sort of more the full funnel metrics and how we're ultimately converting into opportunities and wins. And the fourth one is around people. I spent time talking about the team, how they're feeling, what's top of mind for them, etc. And so nearly 8 weeks into the year, still on top of it. And it's being read, which I think I get questions on line items within the report. So I found it a good organizing construct to track the work that's being done on the team, but then also market that activity internally to stakeholders across the board.
So just to clarify, you're sending this to the whole company, not just the marketing?
Yeah, I send it to an executive leadership team made up of cross-functional folks. I send it to this select group of individuals, also because I'm just mindful about not spamming the entire organization. But I do publish a summary quarterly of the achievements of the team to the broader company audience. And that's working out pretty well.
Yeah, I love that because I think, any marketers listening to this who struggle with what you just said, like showcasing what they're doing, the value of it, this is a good framework potentially for doing that. So thank you for sharing that.
And it's a good framework too for, I think, one-on-ones, right? Like that you have either with your team or, your manager, right? Because I also found like one-on-ones tend to meander on different topics without structure.
Definitely.
Right. So this is a forcing function for documenting productive one-on-one conversation.
Yeah, that's amazing. Well, thank you so much, Jeremiah, for coming on. This was really interesting. I know there's so many more things that we could have talked about, but let's end it at that. Thanks again for coming on, and hopefully see you at Money 2020 Vegas.
Always love talking to you. Thanks so much.
Thank you for listening. You can find show notes and information about guests at fintechmarketinghub.com/podcast. And finally, huge thanks to Arama.tv for producing this podcast. We look forward to having you on our next episode.